The year is 476 AD. The mighty Roman Empire has fallen. Barbarian hordes roam the lands, cities crumble, knowledge is lost, or so we've been told. For centuries, we've been led to believe that the so-called Dark Ages were a time of ignorance and decay, 1,000 years of stagnation. But what if everything we thought we knew was wrong? The fall of Rome didn't mean the end of civilization. In fact, on its ruins, new worlds were rising. The Eastern Roman Empire, better known as Byzantium, thrived for another 1,000 years. To the east, the Islamic Golden Age ushered in an era of unparalleled scientific and cultural advancements. And in the West did not simply descend into chaos. Yes, this was an age of transformation, but alongside destruction, there was renewal. Europe was not plunged into complete darkness. It was evolving, setting the stage for the Renaissance. It was in these very monasteries that ancient knowledge was preserved. Here, the seeds of the first universities were planted. Here, technological innovations emerged that would change the world. In this video, we will uncover the real story of the so-called Dark Ages. What truly happened in the centuries after Rome's fall? How did this period lay the foundation for the world we live in today? Welcome to Echoes of Lost Epochs. Now, let's dive into history. The fall of Rome, a moment so infamous it has become the ultimate symbol of a civilization's demise. But history is never that simple. Rome did not fall in a single day. It did not collapse in a single battle. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not an explosion. It was a slow, agonizing descent into ruin. But why? What forces led to the end of an empire that had once ruled the known world? For centuries, Rome had stood unchallenged. From the misty shores of Britannia to the scorching deserts of North Africa, it was the unshakable heart of the ancient world. But by the 4th century, cracks had begun to form. A once powerful empire was now struggling under the weight of corruption, economic collapse, and endless wars. The legions that had once conquered the world were now stretched too thin, forced to defend borders that were simply too vast to hold. And then came the invaders. But were they really invaders? The term barbarian conjures images of ruthless savages, destroying everything in their path. But the truth is far more complex. Many of these so-called outsiders had lived within Rome's borders for generations. They had served in its armies, traded in its markets, and in many ways they were as Roman as the people who ruled the empire. Yet when Rome turned its back on them, when treaties were broken, promises abandoned, and they were left to fend for themselves, these former allies became Rome's greatest threat. Then in 410 AD, the unthinkable happened. Rome, the eternal city, was sacked. Alaric and his Gothic warriors entered its gates, not as mindless destroyers, but as men who had been betrayed. They did not burn the city to the ground, nor did they seek its total destruction. They took what had been denied to them: gold, food, security. They did not destroy Rome. They exposed its weakness. But the true death of Rome was not sealed by fire and steel. It came from within. A government so divided, its own leaders fought against each other instead of their enemies. An economy shattered by inflation, corruption, and reckless spending. And an army that was no longer filled with disciplined Roman soldiers, but mercenaries, men who fought for gold, not for Rome. And then in 476 AD, it was over. The last emperor of the West was deposed. There was no grand final battle, no last stand. Rome, the great empire that had once ruled the world, was gone. Or was it? Because while the West had fallen, Rome's story was far from over. In the East, a new Rome endured, strong, defiant, and ready to carry its legacy forward for another 1,000 years. Knowledge survived, culture thrived, and from the ashes of the old, a new world was beginning to take shape. But that is a story for another time. Part 1. The myth of the Dark Ages. For centuries, the term Dark Ages has been used to describe this time, 1,000 years of ignorance, superstition, and decline. But was it truly dark? Or is this just another historical myth? The West is fragmented, while the East, Byzantium, remains strong. Yes, the fall of Rome brought chaos to the West. Kingdoms crumbled, trade routes collapsed, and cities shrank. But while the Western world struggled, others thrived. Across the Mediterranean, knowledge was not lost, it was reborn. Part 2. The Eastern Roman Empire, the shining light of Byzantium. The Roman Empire did not fall completely, it simply changed its form. In the East, Constantinople stood as the new Rome, a beacon of wealth, culture, and innovation. Unlike the crumbling cities of the West, Byzantium was a thriving superpower. Under emperors like Justinian, Byzantium preserved Roman law, advanced architecture, and even expanded its territory. The Code of Justinian, a legal system that would influence European law for centuries, was created here. The Byzantines also developed one of history's most mysterious and deadly weapons, Greek fire, a liquid weapon that could burn even on water, giving them naval dominance for centuries. Part 3. The Islamic Golden Age, the new center of knowledge. Meanwhile, to the south and east, a new civilization was rising, the Islamic Caliphates. While much of Europe struggled, the Islamic world became the center of science, medicine, and philosophy. This was the Islamic Golden Age. It was here that the knowledge of the ancient world was not only preserved, but expanded. Greek philosophy, Persian mathematics, and Indian astronomy all merged under one roof. Al-Khwarizmi's work laid the foundation for algebra, a word that comes directly from his book, Al-Kitab al-Mukhtasar, fi Hisab al-Jabr wal-Muqabala. Hospitals, medical textbooks, and the first experimental scientific methods flourished under scholars like Ibn Sina, Avicenna, whose canon of medicine would be used in European universities for centuries. Part 4. The Carolingian Renaissance, a king's dream to restore knowledge. But what about the West? Was Europe truly drowning in ignorance? Not entirely. In the 8th century, one ruler sought to change that. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, and later emperor of the Romans. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian Renaissance began, a revival of learning, literature, and governance. Monasteries became Europe's first schools. Ancient texts were copied and preserved, and for the first time in centuries, a standardized writing system, Carolingian minuscule, was developed to ensure knowledge could be read by future generations. So were the Dark Ages truly dark? Perhaps for some, but history is never one-sided. As some civilizations fell, others rose. Knowledge was never lost. It simply moved, changed, and evolved. And in time, it would all come together again to spark the flames of the Renaissance. The echoes of history never fade. They simply wait to be rediscovered. Part 1. The survival of knowledge, more than just a dark age. The fall of Rome did not mean the fall of knowledge. While much of Western Europe faced political and social turmoil, its intellectual traditions did not simply vanish into the shadows. They found refuge in the unlikeliest of places. In the quiet halls of monasteries, scribes worked tirelessly, preserving the wisdom of the past. Manuscripts from ancient Rome and Greece were copied, studied, and protected. Without them, works by Aristotle, Galen, and Euclid might have been lost forever. Here, Part 2. The architects of the Middle Ages, more than just castles and cathedrals. But the Middle Ages were not just about preservation, they were also about innovation. The cathedrals of Europe were not mere places of worship, they were marvels of engineering. The invention of the flying buttress allowed walls to soar higher, filled with breathtaking stained glass that told stories in light. The Middle Ages also saw the rise of new architectural and engineering techniques. The windmill, the mechanical clock, even the concept of public hospitals, all of these took shape during this time. Part 3. The medical advances of the medieval world. And what about medicine? It is often said that the medieval world was dominated by superstition, but the reality is far more complex. Physicians across Europe and the Islamic world built upon Greek and Roman medical knowledge. In Baghdad, Ibn Sina, known as Avicenna, compiled the Canon of Medicine, a text so influential it was used in European medical schools for centuries. While medieval medicine was not perfect, it was far from primitive. Early surgical techniques, anesthesia, and even the concept of quarantine were developed in these so-called Dark Ages. Part 4. The Islamic scholars who kept science alive. But one of the greatest centers of knowledge in the medieval world was not in Europe at all. In the Islamic world, science and philosophy flourished. Scholars like Al-Hasan made breakthroughs in optics, Al-Khwarizmi laid the foundations for algebra, and medical advancements surpassed those of the ancient world. Here, the works of Plato, Aristotle, and Hippocrates were not only preserved but expanded upon. Astronomers refined celestial models. Chemists laid the groundwork for modern pharmacology. And mathematicians introduced concepts that would shape the very language of science. Part 5. The birth of universities. The first steps toward the Renaissance. By the 12th century, a new institution was rising in Europe, the university. Places like the University of Bologna and the University of Paris became centers of learning, where scholars gathered to study law, medicine, and philosophy. Education was no longer limited to monasteries. The medieval university laid the foundation for the intellectual explosion that would come centuries later, the Renaissance. So were the Dark Ages truly dark, or have we simply been looking at them through the wrong lens? Yes, there were wars. Yes, there were struggles. But this was also an era of knowledge, of discovery, of survival. The echoes of the ancient world were never truly silenced. They were carried forward, waiting for their moment to reignite the flame of learning. And in time, that moment came. The Renaissance was not born from nothing. It was built on the shoulders of those who came before. Without the scholars of Byzantium, without the translators of the Islamic world, without the medieval universities, the Renaissance as we know it would never have happened. History is not a series of endings. It is a chain of echoes, stretching through time, shaping the world we live in today. So, what do you think? Were the Dark Ages truly dark? Or have we misunderstood history all along?